welcome back. This is our final session of the day. And I've been given the pretty hard task of doing lessons learned and trying not to repeat anything that has been said all day. But I'm sure we're going to have some juicy topics to be discussed. First of all, I'm Brogan MacDonald. I'm Head Sustainability at Building Structures at Ramble, and where I have the fantastic role of getting to support all of our structural engineers across the business in doing things like steel reuse and challenging embodied carbon, and even delving into systems thinking and regenerative design. I used to be a structural engineer. I still am a structural engineer. And back in 2018, I tried to make steel reuse work pretty unsuccessfully. And I remember one contractor saying to me, "Are you daft?" Because it just wasn't a thing there. And to reflect and be able to kind of moderate this panel and seeing all the fantastic stuff that we've been talking about today just shows you how far we've come. So we've got a long way to go, and there's still some barriers, and there's still some big lessons to be discussed. And I think it goes without saying that we all agree that early collaboration and early engagement is great, but we're still facing tricky challenges. So how can we ensure that we're not having the same conversations this time next year at Circular Steel? So I hope to kind of put some tricky questions to our panelists, and we really want to deep dive into some of more tricky things that we've learned on our projects, or the great things that have meant that it's been really successful, and we can share these with the audience today. So let's introduce our panelists, and then we'll get straight into it. Dimitrios.
Good evening. My name is Dimitrios Tziogas-Papandreou. I'm the head of temporary works for Multiplex. I'm with them for the last 9 years. In the last years, I'm also helping out with tenders in new projects, and one of the main things we are looking at is how we can reduce embodied carbon, and one of the things that we are looking for some of these projects is to utilize reused steel. And today I will be speaking mostly about the New Zealand House, a 20-story refurb building in just off Trafalgar Square.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm Dan Pitkin. I'm a project manager for GPE. We're lucky enough to have been involved in the 2AS scheme that I think you've heard about earlier today, and the 180 Piccadilly scheme, which is the donor and then the recipient building for a big steel reuse scheme. So as well as the kind of day job of developing buildings, massive part of what we do is sustainability and reuse, and a huge focus because of our involvement on 2AS and Piccadilly in reusing steel and putting a whole new structural frame up with reused steel. So hoping to expand on some of the lessons learnt from that today.
My name's Stephen Dorer. I'm Steelwork Operations Director at Deconstruct, responsible for all of the design, manufacture and installation of structural steelwork, both new and reused.
I'm Kiro Tamer. I work in Holly's team as Head of Environment at Calbury. I help Calbury identify risks and opportunities against the environment. It still is our second biggest Scope 3 emitter. So we've invested a lot of time to understand how we can actually provide a more efficient solution to our clients.
And I'm just still here.
You got to keep the Brittany mic with me as well. So I've been thinking about everything that's been discussed today, and to kind of some conclusions to it. And one word that has been brought up in every panel in some way or another is compromise. And I think that's a really interesting discussion for our projects that we worked on. What compromises have we had to make, and what compromises have our other stakeholders had to make in this? And it's great that both Kiro and Dan have worked on the same project, and I think there would be interesting viewpoints from each side of the contractor and the client on that. And 2 Aldermany Square, I'm going to call it 2AS for short,
2AS
has recovered 1,500 tonnes of steel, and there's 700 tonnes were reused on the project. That is a phenomenal amount. It's, huge, huge achievement. So, Dan, first of all, what compromises did you have to make as a client for that to be successful? And then we'll get Kiro's point of view afterwards.
My answer is the easy one. It was cost and programme.
Yeah.
What we would have loved to have done was to known at the start of the job that we were going to recover all that steel and that we were going to use it in the 2AS project and in the Piccadilly project. We weren't quite advanced enough at the stage when we signed the Keltbray contract to know that that was going to be our business plan for the two schemes. So we'd already set off on a journey with Keltbray to demolish the building, and then we had to talk to them about deconstructing it, which quite rightly had a cost and a programme impact because it's a different way of working. And what was really nice is that Keltbray worked with us on that. Didn't just say, here's a 6-month delay and a £5 million bill. It was all open book, above board, and we got to a pretty good position. But it is an investment. We had the opportunity with the donor building, and the key lesson learnt is have a donor building and have a project for that donor building to go to. And if you do that, it's easy, but it's hardly ever the case that the stars align and that works. So you just have to accept that if you want to go through the process of potentially saving 100 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared in your new building, which is kind of where we're getting to in terms of the overall embodied carbon, that doesn't come for free. And particularly when you do it the first time and you need to go through the contractual, the programme, all the processing that goes with it, when you set out on that journey and it's not a tried and tested route, there's got to be some acceptance that it's going to come with a cost and it's going to come with a programme impact. And luckily the business got behind us and said, we're willing to accept that because we can see the benefit of it.
That's great. So did you have to present that back to your board?
Yeah, we had to get sign off initially with not a lot of evidence that it was going to work. Some fairly high level numbers in terms of we think this is what it's going to cost. But it was a 10-minute presentation and the executive committee said, yeah, it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't we do it?
Well, I want to work with them. Okay. I mean, gosh, that would be an easy client conversation to have. It's definitely not what I've had. Okay, so Kiro, what kind of compromises to help you have to make, to work with GP on that?
Cost and programme.
Okay.
Very similar. I mean, I think, so I don't repeat what Dan just said, I think it just wouldn't be possible if the client wasn't on board and ultimately were willing to it and specified it and ultimately said, yes, you can do it. Because if they didn't want the steel and the steel wasn't to be designed in the new build, then we would be creating structural steel elements for the client that didn't want.
Yeah.
So we would be paying for that additional cost and programme that the client didn't want. But yeah, the cost and programme ultimately comes because you need additional crane times, you need additional labour, you need the crane to take it down, clean it up, crane to load it, and that's where our cost and came in for additional labour, and then ultimately that's an implication on programme.
And it's skilled labour as well, which we're quite short of now in the UK.
And it's not been done before, so we learned it on the job.
So were there any other kind of lessons learned from the contractor's point of view in terms of logistics or communication with other stakeholders that really stood out as something that supported that reuse on that project? Yeah,
and like Danny alluded it to in the sense that it was in extent to the last minute request, or in the grand scheme of things, it was a last minute request, so we wouldn't have expected, because we didn't design to do it in the first place, to that extent how much crane time it would have taken. And then Scott is in the room and he'll say the next step to cutting it is unbolting it. So there are different means, and then you then lose less steel per cut that you carry out in order to recover the steel. Yeah. And I guess one thing that we can't compromise on in this whole process, and it hasn't been discussed much today, is health and safety. Because we talked about cranes, we're adding back in 3 elements we've tried to design out in the last 20 years: craneage, manual handling, working at height. So, I mean, Stephen, do you have any experience that, being on site, doing this with your team, are we talking about the health and safety impacts enough?
Probably not. We've actually got a job right now where we've been asked to take out existing steelwork that's encased in lead paint. There's so many factors that could occur. The actual logistics of where you're actually taking beams out of, the location of them, how high you need to get to, like particularly in the cut and carve environment where you're taking beams out from the 3rd floor of a 12-storey building. They don't come out easily. They don't come out with a hook. It's all manpower, and it's all distribution across floor slabs and down and out and so forth. So it's not considered as much, and obviously there's cost elements to that as well that need to be considered, and the cost element to the safety mechanisms you need to put in place. So The lead paint, for example, we're having to do that under extreme control conditions. So it's almost asbestos-like conditions. So that there are things that need to be considered when you're actually thinking about, I want to reuse that beam.
Well, we've spoke about today, like, sometimes reuse isn't the right, route for a project, and we have to be more pragmatic. It's a finite resource at the moment. So do you think that was the right call on that project, given that it was covered in lead paint? You've got to be careful.
Probably not in the grand scheme of things, because the actual time it's taken to get to where we need to get to it's had an impact.
Yeah. Okay. And Roy, you've been in this game a long time. So, you said you've been doing, reused steels for 50 years. And what you've learned in that time period, what compromises do people in this room need to be prepared for to get it to work on the job if they're working with you?
The longest sort of historical experience is considering alternatives. And I'm going to go back to my second-hand car salesman now, unwittingly. I often joke about our business, which is our business is to sell people something they never asked for, because we can't always offer what's required, so we have to offer what's available. So sometimes you have to consider a different size, sometimes you have to consider a different grade, sometimes the lengths may not work. But then we've got to be pragmatic. So there's got to be then the case, it's no point in just saying, well, it's going to be reused, so we're going to do anything on God's earth to make this piece work. And I'm sure, EMR will have learned the same lesson, and Stephen as well, I'm sure. The jobs we look at and just walk away from, that's more than a compromise, but it's the question that sometimes this isn't practical. So you have to have that in mind as well. It may be an ambition, but ultimately, thankfully the market's moved past that just be, we can't do this. As a couple of years ago, the conversation was, we want to reuse, no, you can't do that. And that was the end of it. The market's much more informed, the market's much more willing. So you've then got to listen to the arguments that are being put to you about what the problems are going to be. Because now the problems aren't always just about somebody trying to get some more money out of you or steer the project down a different route. There's a lot of silly little nitty-gritty things that make life quite tricky.
So what would you say is some of those practicalities then that you need to be realistic about for it to work?
They've been alluded to in different ways throughout, but one of the things as the stockholder, we assess what the material we've got can be used for. We've got too many people trying to look at it to decide what they might want to use. And I was giving an example earlier. If I've got something in my inventory marked down as bent, it could be a banana. The whole thing could be bent from one end to the other, or it could have a kink in the middle. I'll have it as a 12-metre bent length, but I might be able to sell it as 2 5-metre straight lengths and a bent bit in the bin. So it's a question of making sure the material gets matched to the job. Jonathan's alluded to it. If the holes fall in the wrong place, you can't drill a hole where there's a hole already. You can't run a weld over where a weld's already been, because it affects the weld performance, the RWC aspects. So just remember that downstream, people that are having to get this done, and I hear a lot of this with the defects as well, we can engineer for defects. You can engineer for dented flanges. Engineers are great, they can pretty much work with anything. But the poor beggars downstream might struggle to actually get that to fly later on. As a simple example, I'd never considered why there isn't actually we call it a ding tolerance, but the reason that people don't want deflected flanges is because you can't make connections to them. It sounds really obvious, but it's often a point that's missed. So yes, there's a dent, nobody cares. Suddenly we do care because we want to land another connection right on top of it. And with reused steel, it really does come down to those small details as to whether it will succeed or fail. And as a stockholder, or in turn, if you're the fabricator appointed by guys on donor projects, it has to be looked down to that level of detail for certain pieces.
Thank you. And Dimitrios, you faced some challenges with reuse yourself on your projects. What kind of lessons did you face on there? Like what didn't work well, and then what compromises did you have to make?
What Dan said earlier resonated well with me. One thing that needs to be done is early stakeholder engagement, and the clients, the design teams, even before the principal contractor has joined the discussion, have explored these opportunities for reused steel, and besides all the other carbon reduction opportunities. The main thing that I encountered in New Zealand House, and this is the case for Holborn Viaduct and One Exchange Square, our projects, is that we presented this as an opportunity during the tender stage, but the tender stage was in stage 3. So there was already an inertia in the design team to produce and complete stage 3, go to stage 4. And it was much harder to also persuade the client of the changes that are required program-wise, cost-wise, in order to achieve this in the design. So the main compromise is that also another thing is understand that reused steel is not the only path to reduce embodied carbon, and there are other ways. And Roy kind of said that as well. We can explore other opportunities, and it's parallel to GGBS, for instance, for concrete. We cannot see it as a marketing tool only, and we have to see what actual value it adds versus the cost.
I think it's an interesting one as well you bring on GGBS, because we're having problems now in the market where some people, and similar to even lower embodied carbon steel, where some are starting to kind of hoard it, and at the expense where others can't use it, and we have these finite resources. So it might reduce your project carbon, but not necessarily global. So Roy, you as a stockholder, you reserve stock for people now, but you said in the previous one that you've reserved stock and then the job hasn't happened. So what do you see the future of that? Are you going to have to start charging to reserve stock, or are you going to just say, if you're not going to use it in a year, we're going to stop?
I'll make one point to start with, because it's a year between events. So the first thing to understand with steel, and I'm old enough now, this is my 4th economic cycle, but when I sat and talked to everybody last year, beams were selling for £1,100 a tonne new. Last week they were selling for £680 a tonne. Scrap was £400 a tonne roughly, maybe £380 last September. If you're lucky now on site, you'll get £230. It's probably £270 on the dock. So as a backdrop, when people then ask me to hang on to material for a year, but don't want to discuss the price or pay anything, how do we cope with that as a business? Well, the answer is we can't. My big issue with contractual stuff, and apologies for we had a lawyer in the room earlier, but usually these things are resolved commercially, big players excluded. I can't afford to be in a contract that I'm going to have to fall out with somebody about. So we can ask for deposits. I've yet to find anybody prepared to pay one. And I don't really want to take it, because if I take your deposit off you to last September at £1,000 a tonne, and then you want to go into the market this September at £700 a tonne, you're not going to feel rosy inside, which is an issue to then address when it comes to commercial relationships going forward. So it's very, very difficult to know when a project's certain and when to commit the inventory to it. We cooperate as much as we can. We're setting a 3-month time limit as a matter of course. But that's been my single biggest shock getting involved with more London construction, is A, how many jobs just don't happen. And for us as a stockholder, normally when we don't win a job, it's because there were 5 people bidding and somebody else won it. It would appear in London construction about 80% of the jobs just vanish in a puff of smoke and never see the light of day. But then equally, there's just delays. So you can get projects go back a year or 2 years, and you can't economically or commercially deal with that. So we try and cooperate as much as we can. If people can commit, that's great. If they come to us, sometimes you get a sense the design's final or final enough. Nothing's ever certain. But there's also times now when you realise that we're stage 1 and this could end up being a car park, not a zoo.
Fair enough. Thank you for that, Roy. And Dan, I want to go back to the programme, because like a 6-month delaying programme could make plenty of jobs, uneconomically feasible. That's a huge challenge for many people. Did you see any cost savings returned from that programme hit because you didn't have to buy that virgin steel?
So it wasn't a 6-month delay.
With
Keltbray. It was a matter of weeks because of their sort of appetite for just finding the best solution. And it wasn't a £5 million project, cost impact either. So yes, there is a programme impact, there is a cost impact. Did we recover it all from having reused steel rather than having to buy new steel on the Piccadilly project? No. I think we probably broke even on the cost of the steel. So we owned the steel from 2ES. We had to pay to recover it. and there's a cost for that. Then we had to pay to process it and store it until the Piccadilly scheme is ready for it to go to fabrication. And to one of Roy's points, it depends when you do the comparison. If you do the comparison when we were costing the job 12 months ago, yes, there was a saving because of steel prices were high at that point. If you do the comparison now, probably it's cost us a little bit more. The other problem we've got in the market in general is that time lag, and it's not just from confirming the design of the project, wanting to go out and buy the steel for fabrication, which, you're right, can shift because of all sorts of different factors. We're now being asked by local authorities to confirm what our embodied carbon is, really early stages, to even get planning permission in the first place. And to do that through committing to using an amount of reused steel to get our embodied carbon down, we need certainty probably 18 months before we even finalise the design. So how do we as an industry get over that problem of securing the supply of material, securing the embodied carbon saving, and not have it sat on Roy's shelf for 3 years with the price going up and down and no one having any certainty on cost?
Yeah, it certainly feels like we need some heavy incentives to drive this for the clients because, these programming cost things are not going to go away. Until that happens, we could have 10 more of these conferences and be really keen, but until this gets incentivized, whether from government or, in planning, then we're going to be repeating ourselves time and time again.
But can I just add, just to take some heat off of steel?
Go on.
That timing and circular economy, or timing is what's really hard on the circular economy. You can scavenge as much as possible from a building, structural and non-structural, but if you don't need it at that time, that's when it is the biggest challenge. Because if someone doesn't need it, then it's a waste. Someone might need it in 6 months' time. You take it, you package it, you store it, and then you have to integrate into the design, just to take a little bit of heat from steel, because it's not just steel related. It's this challenge with circular economy.
Yeah, definitely. And Stephen, we had a conversation previously that there was one thing that you invested in that really helped with steel reuse. What was the one thing?
Surveys, massive. So on all our jobs now, we do a try and encourage people to get in, open it up as early as possible. The lead paint example would be an example of proof we'd have found that out much earlier than when we actually landed on site. Doing point cloud surveys, because particularly in London, refurbishment buildings, I don't think I've walked into a single one that looks exactly like the existing drawings or as people expected. They're all different nuances. Learning about that element of the structure in terms of the connections and how you're actually physically going to take it back down again. Rarely do you get fabricators' drawings with it, and do you understand where stiffeners are and how the connections actually work. You get lines on a drawing that give you an idea. By getting in there and doing those surveys early, you get to learn about that and you get to formulate a better informed plan of exactly how you're going to take it down, which particularly in cut and carve environments is probably 90% of the challenge.
And Dimitrios, when you've worked with clients, have you found that recipe for success has been their engagement and collaboration from the beginning, or have you managed to succeed without having a client that wasn't really bought into steel reuse?
Everyone buys the idea. It's a very good idea, to be frank. The problem is that it requires an upfront investment, which the other speakers suggested. And this is the difficult part, that this has to be included in the brief, and everyone in the design team has to be aware and working towards that as a core goal. So, for instance, for New Zealand House, it's a very particular building because we have spatial constraints. You cannot tweak your steel sections infinitely to use reused steel, for instance, instead of virgin steel. It's for the structural engineers as well to accept that the steel will not look like virgin steel. It will have some existing castellations, some fin plates, certain welds that, although they don't look like new, still you can work around them and you can understand where the stress concentrations are. And if, for instance, you intend to use a steel beam that has penetrations in an area where you expect high shear, then perhaps it's not a good idea. But if you don't have that and your web is not intact, probably it will still work. So it has to be included in the brief, and the design teams should be working towards that and having this in the back of their mind when they're specifying something.
So you think our design teams need to be a little bit more flexible?
Possibly as well.
Because Roy, you had a viewpoint on that engineers are maybe a bit too prescriptive, which I don't disagree with you on.
We've found the more prescriptive at the start, the less likely you are to achieve the end result, unfortunately. Stock matchers, for instance, are a very strong tool, but it goes back to my point before. If the drill hole is in just the wrong place, then that piece isn't usable. So we require flexibility specifically to make sure that we get the best use out of the material for the application it's going to and that it's appropriate. But the other thing, and I understand the dilemma, because engineers want to promise or demonstrate a carbon saving by reuse of a certain percentage, but by trying to nail it down too early, it's almost guarantees that that won't be the number that gets arrived at. And we see it all the time when we're supplying the job. We get dropout. We go to the stack, we look at the thing and we go, we can't send that. That isn't going to work for this piece. And we don't have another piece. So that's a piece of reuse then that hasn't occurred. But if you're too prescriptive at the start, I could have received another 1,000 tonnes in the meantime, none of which is now being considered for that job. Now, in some instances, they're so prescriptive that they want a particular piece for our inventory for a particular application, and I can't even swap one for the other. In other cases, we get that flexibility, so at least we can swap one piece of 203, 203, 46 for another.
Yeah.
But it goes back to what I was saying before, and about your point about compromise. We're always trying to find the best solution to that problem, and it's not always the exact answer that people were looking for. And the other thing is length. I've had it a bit recently where people want to know what length we're taking it from. Well, that's a red herring. It's down to me as the stockholder. It was scrap before I got it. If some of it's scrap after I've finished with it, that hasn't had a carbon impact. It's the bit you reuse that saves the carbon. And it's more of an economic and a practical argument as to, should I use a 9 metre beam to create a 5? Probably not. Should I use a 9 metre beam with a whole load of drill holes in a couple of places to create 2 3 metre beams? Very possibly. But those sorts of decisions can be taken at the stockholder end or the project engineer side, not at the engineering point, if you like.
Well, engineers are challenged and pressured by the architect and the MEP engineers as well. But I don't think, is there any architects in the room? Any MEP engineers in the room? Special MEP engineer. So maybe actually we need to be having these compromise conversations with our design team as well, because especially later on, you wouldn't dare to try and change some of it, especially when you're on like a really complex cut and carve where it's a Swiss watch, the whole design. So, trying to change a beam size to get in steel reuse is quite the challenge. So maybe we need to be compromising with the design team as well earlier on.
The other thing there as well, to be fair, and that's cost and programme. Sometimes I asked a question about a simple grade change. Sometimes you get the answer in 24 hours, sometimes it's 4 weeks later.
Yeah.
And fabricators certainly don't want to be waiting for an answer for 4 weeks before you can tell them whether you can send something in or not. So it's quite tricky from that point of view.
Yeah. Okay, I think that we are ready for some questions.
Can I just make one point, because I've found nowhere to drop it, and it's a bit of a bomb in a sense.
Buckle up.
Go on.
One of the things that you need to be aware of, and it's become much more prevalent, even today I've had to field it twice. Everybody here is on board with steel reuse. I've sat in with a government minister and discussed this 8 or 10 years ago, so I'm fully confident that it's legitimate, etc. There are some accredited bodies that will not sign off fabricators to CE mark steelwork for reuse. The BCSA, SCCS sponsored ones definitely do, but there are a couple of others that don't. Now, if anybody wants a really boring 30 minutes of their life, give me a ring and I'll talk you through how that works. I have no issues, and I can't remember which department it is now, but it was DCLG. There is no specific issue. But in terms of the tick box exercise, and we're seeing one-man band consultants that do pre-audit preparations for fabricators just say no. And I've sent 3 really long emails off to 3 of these people explaining the entire situation, and I just get blanked at that point, and they just say no some more. So it sounds really negative. It's not, but please make sure if you're getting engaged with the fabricators, that, or if you know which fabricators you're going to engage with, that's something that you've checked out. We know it's not an issue for liability insurance and all the rest of it because we've been doing it for 50 years. But if you can't get somebody to mark the material off, then it's a problem in the system for sure.
It's a problem we're even facing right now, and we've done this a few times. We're working with a smaller fabricator, and they've just come back saying, CE marking things, and had Michael on the line to help us out as well. So there's still I think there's still a bit of a cultural impact with some smaller
fabricators. It's also the
fabricators.
interpretation of the N1090. You can interpret it very tightly and not go very far through the standard and decide to stop there. And that is happening on occasion.
Yeah. Okay, so we got some good questions. First one, does the fluctuating market cost of steel affect steel reuse? Anyone?
No idea yet. It shouldn't do fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Kiro, any comments on that? You're not keeping tight on the cost. Okay.
In the most polite way.
Roy, what are the forces? What are forces having the biggest impact on the price of steel? Would more circular steel supply drive the market down? Consequences to Cleveland?
The forces on steel. The man sat here might be able to answer this question better than me, but it's a global commodity, so it becomes very, very complex. One of the things that's absolutely driving things at the moment is that the Chinese construction market's on its knees, and China has got a hell of a lot of steel production. Most of the world has sanctioned Chinese steel production, so there's not very many places Chinese steel can go. Scrap prices fluctuate based on demand. Construction generally, the US economy is not where people want it to be, our economy is not where people want it to be. I think I saw the German economy described as something quite uncomplimentary yesterday as well. I don't think reuse is big enough to have a material impact, but basically steel is a commodity, it's supply and demand. When construction becomes inactive, then the first thing that happens is scrap drops because there's no demand for the scrap to make new steel products with. The mills then passionately try and keep their price up because they're not doing much volume. At a certain point, which we've now reached, the mills then panic because they're not getting any work at all because they've priced it too high, and then they slash their prices. And that's why every 10 years approximately we see this doubling and halving of steel prices and scrap prices. And this is my fourth go on that merry-go-round in the steel industry. So it's not, what you're seeing now isn't exceptional. It's what happens every 10 or 12 years. And it's driven by global market forces. I'm not sure, Michael alluded to it earlier, the EFs in the UK, impossible to know whether they're not a big enough factor in global steel to affect global prices.
Drop in the ocean.
So unless there's unilateral quotas, tariffs, sanctions or otherwise, then they're not going to be a factor in prices. But we are seeing quotas and tariffs and otherwise all over the world in steel at the moment. And that's hard to predict. The US have just gone from 30 to 50% on Chinese steel. Europe are at 30%. We class them as a developing nation, weirdly, so there's no tariff for China into the UK at the moment. But that can change overnight.
We certainly saw it with Ukraine as well.
Yeah, Ukraine was,
The price went like mental.
Yeah.
Okay, I really like the second question. Who's making the initial contact with Cleveland or EMR? Is it the client, the main contractor, fabricator? And how often is it the same business that procures it? Because my experience has been, when I've done this in the past, it's been like the person passionate about making it happen on the project does the legwork. And, if you're passionate about making, you will do what you need to do. You'll go out and do all the contacts. My view is that I would like project managers to manage this because it is, engaging with all stakeholders and it is a project management role. So I was quite happy to see G&T and Mace talking about steel reuse because that definitely didn't happen in my previous jobs. But Dan, what's your view? Who do you think should manage it?
I mean, for 2AS and 180 Piccadilly, we made contact with EMR initially. about a year before we got board approval to go and spend the money and see if we could make it work, we had the idea of marrying up the two designs of the building. And then we needed someone, because we were in a donor-recipient situation, we needed someone to manage that process for us. So we got in touch with EMR. We had a separate agreement with EMR before we got the main contractor on board for the recipient building. That's not always possible with the situation of having a donor. What we do for all our projects going forward is whoever the deconstruction demolition contractor is, part of their package is pre-demolition audit, and not just steel, but all materials that can be salvaged, split out with values against them. So regardless of what happens with the design, we've got the options on those materials to do something with them. My opinion is it's got to be client driven, because you need to do it early. The client's got to be on board with not just the process of it, but the cost and the management of it. And if it's the project managers doing it, they should only be doing it with the client's consent anyway.
Yeah.
I've got nothing against the main contractor coming in and saying we've got some advantages, or even the fabricators saying, look, we can offer you some reuse steel instead of new steel, and here's some benefits. But for me, much better if it's driven by the client.
So even if you've got the project manager there, would you rather have that engagement without the project manager doing it and stay closer to it?
Yeah, it's probably a quirk of us as a developer that we're quite hands-on, or we get in the way a lot if you talk to our PMs. But we like to know what's going on. We like to have those relationships with the supply chain because we feel it gives us better value. Not all clients are like that. Some are just the money and they want someone else to manage it. Yeah. But I think the decision and the drive and the enthusiasm should still come from whoever's holding the purse strings.
Yeah, great. We've got a question from Howard. How well is the demolition sector managing the specialist training required to deconstruct against conventional demolition? Stephen?
To be honest, we have particularly specialist people who are putting the steelwork in and taking it down. So the training mechanisms for them, a lot of it sometimes is ad hoc depending on the situation that occurs and what's actually being asked of you. But in general, the actual training itself is pretty well advanced and pretty good. It does need to be reviewed case by case though, location by location. I think that's probably something that just gets lost a little bit. People think you can take a bit of steel down and that's it, but you really do need to look at the logistics of it and how the job's evolved over that time frame. To that point in time, there may be a great big hole underneath it, and there may be like lead paint, there may be, I don't know, asbestos in that area and things like that. So you do just need to manage those processes as well.
Yeah, great. Next one is, would it not be risky for a client or project to commit to exact reuse percentages in planning permissions? What if they cannot be delivered? So from what I understand, and Ian in the room might be able to tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's any conditions post-planning that requires you to actually execute, or they're certainly hoping to introduce them, but we don't really have the planning officers. Because we have a lot of circular economy statements now that go into the GLA, and you can put all your hopes and dreams and wishes in them and then actually not really deliver, from what I've seen, through to construction. What do you think about that, Dan?
Yes, it is risky, 100%. And we haven't been asked to do it yet, but we can see it coming over the horizon. So trying to prepare for that, and as I was saying earlier, some certainty of supply, even if it's in a range of, we think we can get between 30 and 50% of reused steel, is important. In terms of local authorities having the capability to kind of assess that, they probably need some help from people like Ian and other engineers who support reviews of planning submissions. As we also have sometimes issues with, well, not issues, but we have to resolve our development agreements with superior landlords, and they are becoming more and more keen to deliver on sustainability targets. So it might be written into the development agreement that we have to deliver a certain embodied carbon number. So it's not just planning, it can be landowners that have that requirement as well.
Okay. So we're going to have some challenges if that comes into committing to reuse, because, you know, that's suggesting we're committing at that really early stage, and then we might not be able to procure stock until much closer to the time. So we are relying quite heavily on these donor buildings, and then incentivizing clients to deconstruct the buildings that.
And we need to do both. We need to not just have the stick in terms of meeting embodied carbon targets with planning, but there needs to be a value given to the donor building for the carbon that's being saved, or whatever the right term is, from taking that material out and allowing it to be reused. And at the minute, that is not a thing. I know people are talking to different bodies about how we put a value on the steel, and I think it's module D in the embodied carbon measurement. But until we incentivise people getting more stock out of the existing buildings as they get deconstructed, and building up the stock list to help Roy and EMR people give certainty to suppliers and fabricators, then it's only one side of the coin at the moment.
Yeah. So yeah, module D is a whole other conversation we can have, but what I would just say, if anyone wants to look at that in more detail, to look to the iStruct guide. In the back there's an appendix and explains how you can basically divvy up the carbon associated with the donor and the recipient building. Okay, I think we've got time for one last one. Has anyone developed a roadmap on when to engage parties and what compromises they may face? A shared reference for stakeholders would be invaluable. So I think the ASBP have got some great stuff on Disrupt. If you haven't read that, I'd really recommend. They've got like a business case guide, and it actually goes into the detail of the stakeholder route, the stockish route versus the donor building route. And it talks about, you know, what points you can engage there. So that's a really, really fantastic resource, and they've got the Disrupt 2 launch coming soon. So I think we've come to the end of the day and the end of the panel. Thank you so much to our panelists. And if you had one little takeaway today from this whole session, and we've talked about a lot, and we know that now Roy sells Ford Fiestas on the side. What should be your takeaway? We can start with Dimitrios.
My key takeaway is, and I heard a few times today already, is early stakeholder engagement. Define the brief properly, all the design team to be aware of the target of reducing carbon and reusing steel in particular. And when the principal contractor or even a demolition contractor joins the project, then they should have an understanding of what should be done to maximize the reuse.
Okay, so it's got to be clearly in the brief.
In the brief, yes.
Clearly in the brief, okay. No early engagement, okay? Forbid it now. Some other one.
Yeah, Dimmy's taken all the good ones. I think as an industry, as clients, we have to be prepared to fail. We took a bit of a punt on spending some money, seeing if reuse steel would work. We were lucky, and we had a great team, and it did work. To the point about recovering steel with lead paint that Stephen was talking about, it might not have been the best thing to do in an ideal world, but we'll have learnt something from that, and then you make better decisions next time. So we've got to be willing to take a bit of a risk, and willing to fail.
Yeah, and having a bit of humility.
Yeah.
Great. Stephen?
Really, to be honest, it's learning from experiences. I think a lot of us here are learning on the job. We're all learning all the time in terms of each job we go on faces new challenges and new experiences. And I think the key takeaway from me is everybody's still learning. That's why we're here today. That's why a lot of the points we're discussing is people bringing their ideas and what they've learned from projects. We said no early engagement talk, but the importance of it can't be understated. Okay. Getting people together with their experiences in the room at the right stage early enough is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Kiro?
So it's not early engagement, but I think exposing what do we want out of a project with everyone involved, be it the demolition contractor, the cost consultant, the engineer, the client, and say, do we want carbon, do we want program, do we want cost? And just expose it, because then that will remove all the side conversations that happen outside of the main room. And I think that's really helpful, because then if you've got the client that's on board and the engineer that's on board, the demolition contractor and material supplier, then there's a lot less excuses.
Okay, so cards on the table.
Yeah, early engagement. I'm joking.
And Roy?
Yeah.
I think just trying to leave the doors open. I think because, engineers are answering mathematical problems, you tend to come to very finite answers, whereas I think for reuse to be optimised, for the circular economy to be optimised, you need to look at things with a broader eye. So it might be a very specific detail, but make sure the options for supply are left open.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if you join me to thank our panel.